taking a look at different styles of art, specifically at the idea of stylization, abstraction, and expressionism. Of course, we're also going to be talking about a style that you're already familiar with because we spent quite a bit of time in using this style in the development of your self-portraits earlier in the semester. And of course, this particular style is realism. So, why do we use different styles? Right? What's the purpose? Well, they communicate different ideas and information. Right? And as we work through this presentation, I want you to be using the graphic organizer that is provided. You should have a hard copy provided by your teacher. There is also a link to a Google slide that you can use if absolutely necessary as well. Okay, so as we're going through the presentation, I want you to take notes and to fill in the graphic organizer. You'll notice that each different style has three different bullet points, 1, 2, and 3, to help list out visual characteristics for each of the styles. Please make sure that you're filling in each box as we go. Okay, so before we really begin in trying to understand these visual characteristics, and we already know that there are different types of styles, right? We need to really think about what is style, right? And this is the definition up at the top of your graphic organizer. So specifically, style refers to visual similarities that help us to group artworks that are similar, right? Style kind of helps us to understand the different times and places in which artists are working. Artists will often have their own individual style, but if we start looking around the world, right, we can also say that style is dependent on place. Okay, for example, the geography. The art in Europe is different from the art in South America, or in Africa, or in the Middle East, or in Asia, for example. Okay, so the geography is a key indicator of what different styles a person may be exposed to and affect the development of how they choose to make images. Another factor that is connected to place is often the idea of one's culture. Right? The group of people that you are associated with will also influence what your own particular artwork may or may not look like. Okay, so we can also say that style is dependent upon time. Right? The art of the 1990s would be different than the art of the 1920s, and that was different than the work of the 1600s, the Middle Ages, and perhaps going back all the way to ancient Mesopotamia. Different time periods have different ways of creating visual imagery, and thus they have also different styles. So our first style that we're going to take a look at is the one that we're already familiar with, okay, and that is realism. So realism shows the world as it is, flaws and all, right? If it's ugly, then it's included. I like to think about realism as like using the idea of your school photo as an analogy, right? If you take a picture, okay, of yourself and you don't put it through Photoshop or, for example, an Instagram filter, right? And you just leave it as is, that is realistic, right? That blemish that you have on your face, the pimple on the tip of your nose, all of that is included, and that is realism, right? It's naturalistic, right? If we start putting things through something like Photoshop or those Instagram filters, right, we're starting to distort what the actual image is, right? And we often may think of that as a different style, which we actually call realism. But we're not going to get into that one too much. Okay? But the main idea is that it is an accurate documentation of what's in front of us, right? We're wanting to capture what is real as much as we can understand what reality is. So in order to do that, some of the key visual characteristics that we're going to see is that there's a strong sense of three-dimensionality. We can see that there is a sense of mass in the objects. Often linear perspective is used when creating buildings, and there is a clear definition of the light source, right? So we can see patterns of highlights, midtones, and shadows that are cohesive to create that sense of form or three-dimensionality, that sense of mass, and how objects actually exist within space. So, for example, we can see this image by African-American artist Robert S. Duncanson, right? And there's a foreground, those elements that are closest to us. We can see the cattle in the river. The midground, there's the lake, and then in the background, we have those mountains, right? And often what we're going to see is that there's a lot of detail, right? Lots and lots of detail in realism, especially in foreground elements. And as um, we look farther into the picture space, into the background, things get a little bit blurrier, there's less detail in order to really create that strong sense of depth. Our second style is that of stylization, right? And this is probably one of the oldest, or if it is the oldest form of style that we have. We look back to the paintings in Lascaux or in Australia and in Africa, right? These ancient forms of image making are stylized. And each different culture is going to have a different way of going about their stylization based on the conventions that are really important in terms of communicating key ideas. Right? The stylization of the ancient Egyptians, for example, is different than the stylization that was happening in medieval Europe in the Middle Ages, which is different than the stylization that was happening in India up through the 16 and 1700s. Right? Each culture has a different way of stylizing in order to communicate ideas. But the key here is that stylization is about simplification. You're really just focusing in on the important details in order to ensure that the subject is recognizable, right? It doesn't have to be realistic, but it has to be recognizable. The viewer has to be able to tell what it is that they're looking at. And often, right, what we'll see across many cultures is that stylization utilizes sharp outlines, basic shapes or simplified shapes. There's a cartoonish quality to them, right? And lots of use of flat color, right? There isn't a whole lot of blending in order to create that sense of roundness that we would have seen in realism. Okay, so we can take a look at Haida artist Bill Reed. He was working out on the West Coast, out of Haida Gwaii. And here on the right hand side we can see like really bold, sharp, clean lines. It's bold, it's graphic. It's a reduction of the subject matter to the most important visual elements so that the viewer can understand what it is that they're looking at. Most importantly, okay, is that when we're thinking about culture, right, maybe through this act of stylization, there's some information that is removed so that only a privileged audience is able to understand what the image is all about, right? So myself, as a settler Canadian, right, I have a harder time deciphering the intent and the meaning of this particular image because I'm not entirely certain of the cultural nuances of how the image is actually stylized. All right, on the left-hand side, we can see a painting by Roy Lichtenstein called Drowning Girl. He was famous during the 1950s and 60s for taking comic books as a pop artist and making them part of the fine art world. And again, here we see bold, flat colors. Right, there's some highlighting, but it's flat highlighting through the use of sharp, crisp lines between one section and the next. Right, outlining tends to be a key with this particular style of art as well. Okay. Thirdly, we have abstraction. Right, this one is actually quite a bit of fun, and this one emerged, we see primarily starting in the late 1800s as artists are beginning to deconstruct the world around them. In 1839, the camera was invented, right, out of France, and then it spread very, very quickly around the world. And what the invention of the camera did is it released artists from having the job of recording what's going on in the world. They no longer needed to be realistic because that became the job of the camera. And this freed artists up to do new and exciting explorations with different materials, whether it be painting, sculpture, and printmaking, so that they could start exploring more the emotion of the human experience than recording what was happening in the world around them. So, abstraction is really a distortion of space, right? And it often incorporates variations of color. They can be inspired by life, but may not make what is in the subject look actually accurate, right? There is simplification, but it's also through distortion. And in order to do this, we start breaking down the structure of the object. One thing that we can think about is that abstraction is kind of like looking at the same thing from different points of view at the same time, or looking at the same thing, but over a course of time and making recordings of what we're observing as that object is changing in front of us. Right? So because there's this like lots of investigation and reflection on the part of the artist, this also then translates into the viewer also needing to engage in further investigation to understand what is actually happening. So if we take a look at these two images here, on the left we see Marcel Duchamp's painting The Nude Descending the Staircase. This one is kind of fun because this is a distortion of time and place. So here we can see a figure, right? I'm going to use my mouse. We have the head, right? We have the arm here, right? The torso, the hip joint, and the legs coming down. And all of these other lines are the different phases of this person walking down the stairs. And Duchamp has overlapped each of those successive moments over top of each other in order to create this abstracted, distorted image that's really, really hard to understand and forces the viewer to go in and start looking for smaller details in order to be able to comprehend what's happening. On the right, we have another form of abstraction, this time by Piet Mondrian. This image is called Broadway Boogie Woogie, and I want you to imagine yourself either in a plane or as a bird, and you're flying over New York City, and you're looking down, and we see the grids of all of the streets and the cars in the streets moving back and forth, right? And it's a different way of trying to understand the world around us. Lastly, we have the style of Expressionism. This one is one of the most immediate styles to paint. It's a lot of fun. It's also quite challenging because it requires you to have a really good, solid understanding of the technical strengths and limitations of the medium that you're working with. So going back to the acrylic painting techniques that we were exploring, being able to choose different techniques and understand when and where to apply them are some of the strategies that are required to be an effective expressionistic painter, or artist for that matter. So in paintings, we'll often see this idea of expressive brushstrokes. We can see there's like an aggression. The brushstrokes are done quickly, they're purposeful, right? The whole idea here is that we're trying to convey an emotion through how we apply the paint to the canvas, but also in the colors that we are choosing, right? So in this type of painting, right, an apple doesn't have to necessarily be red. It might be purple, it might be blue, it might be fuchsia. Because what the artist is trying to do is to select a color that is going to help to evoke an emotion so that the viewer is making more abstracted or conceptual connections between their experience of this, of what they're looking at, and the thing itself. Right? So accuracy here is not important. Right? It's not about having that clear sense of three-dimensionality. It's not about simplification. It's really about raw emotion. Okay, so here we can see that Robert Colescott, again an African-American painter from the predominantly working in the 1990s, he often would take famous paintings and recontextualize them in order to bring a greater understanding of the Black experience within a predominantly white-dominated system in the American society, right? So he repurposed images in order to better communicate what his experience of life was. And here he changes up color, he changes up composition, right? There's a boldness, there's an energy in terms of how the paint is done, right? It's kind of aggressive but simplified in order to help us to draw attention to the key visual elements, right? A much older form of expressionism is by Edvard Munch. He painted the screen. This is probably one of the more famous images that you may be familiar with. It's um, quite well known and reproduced widely within popular culture, right? And again, right, there's no real sense of where this is, but we get a sense of the time and the energy, and through the bright colors of the sky, the aggressive painting of the water in the background, the ambiguous figures over here towards the left, and of course, right, the exaggeration that tends to be happening within the face as well. Over the next couple of slides, all right, I'm just going to be putting them up, and I'm simply going to be asking you to self-reflect using the characteristics that we have gone throughout this presentation to identify what style each of the images is. You should be able to use the visual characteristics to help you determine which style each image is made. Okay, so we have our first one here. It's been up for a while, so I'm going to move on to the next one, and I'll just kind of pause for a moment. If you hear that I begin talking again and you haven't quite figured it out, you need to review your notes, just hit the pause button and then restart it once you are ready to go. All right, so hopefully you have a good understanding of some of these different art styles. Remember that we have types, right? There are ways in which we can identify different artworks, and then we have the visual characteristics, and these are the keys that allow us to sort images into the different types. Right? Some of the characteristics may have similarities across styles, so it's important for us to be able to compare more than one visual characteristic in order to make sure that we are sorting and categorizing the images that we are looking at accurately. All right, hopefully you've been able to learn a couple of things about visual style. And the next thing that we're going to start to do is to look at developing your own skill in working with a style that you feel is A, challenging for you, but B, also achievable. All right, so good luck and continue with your investigations into style.